They had no flag, no anthem, not a single official declaration, and yet just one name, assassin, was enough to make kings wake in fear at night. For over 150 years, they moved like shadows, striking without warning, vanishing without a trace. They were called many names, the Nizari, the Ismailis, the Hashashin, that last name echoing like a curse, forever tied to blood, darkness, and secrets that history has never fully uncovered. Who were they? Why did they kill? And why, even today, can history still not explain their existence? Welcome to Bedtime History. Tonight, we journey into the story of the most mysterious organization in human history, not just to revisit their assassinations, but to explore the silence they left behind. So relax, close your eyes, and let history whisper to you. While great empires battled over every inch of land, every flicker of loyalty among the people, in a remote and rugged corner of Persia's Alborz Mountains, a small group quietly built a power of their own. They had no nation, no massive army, but they possessed something no dynasty of the time was wise enough to recognize as the most dangerous weapon of all: the power to plant fear deep within the enemy's heart. The founder of this order was Hassan-i-Sabbah, a scholar, a thinker, and a man cast out by the dominant Islamic religious hierarchy of his day. He never sought to become a prophet, nor did he dream of building a conquering army like others of his time. Instead, he chose wisdom, patience, and calculated strategy as the foundation of his movement. At Alamut Fortress, a place he seized not with force, but with cunning and conviction, he began training the men who would one day reshape history. No one knows exactly what happened behind the walls of Alamut, but the survivors of the assassinations would often say that these killers were unlike any men they had seen. Calm, silent, unshakable. They did not flee, and they seemed utterly unafraid of death. And that, more than the killing itself, was what truly terrified those in power. Not that they died, but that they could not comprehend how someone could kill with such peace in their eyes. In a world where power was measured in empires, armies, and the blood of thousands, the assassins needed only a single blade and one soul willing to die to change the political game. They didn't fight a nation, they fought a system where only the strong held the right to decide who lived and who died. Hassan-i-Sabbah knew they could not survive a direct war. They had to become invisible, letting their enemies crumble under the weight of their own fear. This wasn't just a tactic, it was a philosophy. Inside Alamut there was no blind loyalty. Those chosen to become fidai, those ready to sacrifice themselves, were not only trained in weapons, but in philosophy, strategic thinking, and a deep belief in their mission. They weren't merely assassins. They were the living embodiment of armed conviction. And because they sought no reward, no fame, and left behind nothing but the death of their target, no one could predict where they might come from. Anyone could be a target. No one was too high to be reached. That was the brilliance of their strategy, planting nameless fear into the hearts of the enemy, making them weaken themselves under the constant shadow of paranoia. What's often forgotten is that the Hashashin were not creatures of darkness, as popular tales might suggest. They had their own philosophy, a rich system of thought, and they believed they were resisting oppression with intellect and sacrifice. But history is rarely kind to those who stand outside the accepted order of power, so instead of being remembered as strategists or ideological revolutionaries, They were given a name laced with scorn, hashashin, users of hashish, a slur meant to stain the very faith they lived and died for. And yet, no matter how twisted the story became, their legacy lives on. A small group with no army, no kingdom, made an entire region of the Middle East afraid to sleep. And even now, as the fortress of Alamut lies in ruins, with questions still unanswered, the fear they once stirred has never truly died. The fortress of Alamut was not built from stone alone. It was built from the quiet endurance of those who believed the world could be changed not through swords, but through an unshakable ideal. Perched on a steep cliff in the Alborz Mountains, Alamut seemed to rest on the edge of the known world and the forbidden. From its heights, no one could easily break in, and once inside, few could ever truly walk away. It became a strategic stronghold, a laboratory of radical thought, and the beating heart of a hidden force the world still cannot decipher. No one outside truly knew what training inside Alamut was like, but fragmented stories from those who survived, assassination attempts painted a picture that bordered on the mythical. Young recruits, some as young as 15, weren't brought into the fortress to learn how to kill, but to understand why they had to be ready to die. They studied philosophy, theology, strategy, and cryptography. They weren't driven by whips or fear, but by persuasion, the idea that the world was in the hands of false powers, and that only by sacrificing oneself could that falsehood be undone. There are legends that Hassan-i-Sabbah created a false paradise within Alamut, a place where the young were taken to experience overwhelming pleasure, only to be brought back to harsh reality. He would tell them that what they had seen was a glimpse of the reward awaiting those with absolute loyalty. While many historians doubt the literal truth of the tale, it reflects a deeper reality. This order did not merely control action, it mastered belief. And once a person believes that death is the only path to eternal reward, fear loses its grip. Inside their training, assassins learned how to disappear into crowds, to pose as servants, pilgrims, even the disabled, all to get close to their target. They didn't carry grand weapons. A hidden dagger, a poisoned needle, a single strike to the heart. That was all it took to end the life of a king. But the goal was never just to kill. The goal was to send a message that no matter how powerful you think you are, there is an invisible hand that can reach your throat at any moment. That precision is what made the assassins so terrifying. No one knew how to defend against them. Every time a figure of power died under mysterious circumstances, surrounded by guards inside a church or lost in a crowd, all eyes turned toward Alamut. But no one had proof. No one saw them arrive. No one saw them leave. Only the shadow of fear remained, spreading, tightening, and slowly rotting the confidence of every court from within. Not just kings and princes, but scholars, clerics, generals, anyone who posed a threat to the Ismaili ideal could become a target. This made the assassins a nameless enemy in the eyes of much of the Islamic world, and yet that also made them nearly impossible to destroy. They weren't a nation. They had no borders, no standing army to be defeated. They were an idea, fed by the frustration of those pushed to the margins of history. To the outside world, they were hashashin, fanatics, manipulated minds addicted to illusions of paradise. But within the stone walls of Alamut, they called each other Fida'i, the ones who sacrifice, not to kill for pleasure, but to protect a truth the world wanted to bury. And in that place, within its ancient stones and shadowed halls, they turned loyalty into the most powerful weapon the world had ever seen. There were no drums, no declarations of war, no armies marching, and yet every time a nobleman fell in the middle of a crowd, blood pouring from his heart as he stepped out of a mosque or sat upon a throne, an entire kingdom trembled. No one knew the name of the killer, no footprints were ever found, only one rumor echoed across the lands again and again. The men of Alamut have acted. One of the earliest and most shocking assassinations was the death of Nizam al-Mulk, the Grand Vizier of the Seljuk Empire, a man who held near absolute power under Sultan Malik Shah. He was a brilliant statesman, founder of the Madrasa school system, and the fiercest enemy of the Ismaili sect. In 1092, while on pilgrimage, Nizam was approached by a stranger disguised as a wandering mystic. With a single, precise stab, he was killed on the spot. The assassin was slain immediately after, but the message was clear. His identity and motive left little doubt. He was a Fida'i sent from Alamut. Nizam's death was not just a personal execution, it was a strike at the very heart of Seljuk power. It shook the political foundation, created chaos, and opened cracks through which the Ismailis could slip, survive, and expand. It was the first lesson for the ruling elite. In the right hands, a single dagger could change the fate of an empire. In the years that followed, more prominent figures fell: governors, judges, military commanders. What made these killings even more terrifying was their boldness. They weren't carried out in the shadows. They happened in broad daylight, in full view of witnesses, as if designed to echo across the land. From Persia to Syria, the name Hashashin was whispered with growing fear, and it spread faster than any invading army ever could. Some were killed while preaching. Others were stabbed in their private homes in the middle of secret meetings with trusted advisors. Some collapsed at the gates of mosques surrounded by thousands, and yet no one saw the killer coming. That was the message the assassins wanted: the world to understand not even sacred ground can protect you. Another assassination that sent shockwaves through Christendom was the killing of Conrad of Montferrat, a powerful Christian noble in the Holy Land during the Crusades. In 1192, just days after being elected King of Jerusalem, he was stabbed to death in the streets by two men. They didn't flee, they accepted their execution, and once again the trail led back to one place: Alamut. What's even more astonishing is that in some cases rulers were forced to buy their safety, sending gifts, letters, or secret treaties to the assassins in hopes of avoiding death. When an enemy couldn't be destroyed, people resorted to bribes to stay alive. This made the assassins more than a terrorist group. They became a hidden political force with the power to sway appointments, alliances, and even royal successions. The world of that time had to face a terrifying truth. When death could come at the hands of a nameless stranger, and no one could stop it, power meant nothing. That was the true weapon the assassins held. They didn't need to control territory, they only needed to control the minds of those in power. Over time, people stopped speaking their name aloud. They became ghosts, a whisper, an ever-present dread inside palaces and churches. Those who opposed the Ismaili cause knew what awaited them, not because they were weak, but because they understood that somewhere in the shadows a blade was waiting for the moment they turned their back. There is one thing rulers fear more than sudden death: not knowing where the killer is, or even who they are. This is where the assassins outmatched every other force of their time. They had no massive army, yet their message could spread across the entire Middle East within days. A name written on a scrap of paper. A kill order passed along without a trace of where it began, or where it would end. This invisible network was where the assassins truly lived. No one knows exactly how they communicated. There was no evidence of carrier birds, no official couriers. Yet stories tell of messages traveling through nothing more than a look, a phrase, or an object placed precisely in the right spot. A command could cross deserts, scale mountains, and pass through borders, arriving in the hands of the right person at the right time. It all seemed to move through a language only they understood, a hidden web woven from trust, ritual, and symbols. The signs of the assassins were simple: a small dagger wedged into a doorframe, a coin engraved with a tower, a strip of cloth tied to a tree. To outsiders, they were meaningless, but to a fidai they were codes of survival, signs that they were not alone in this invisible war. There's something else. The assassins almost never left written words, no documents, no commands, written in plain language. And when they did leave messages, they were hidden inside poetry, verses from the Quran, or symbols that seemed random. That's why modern historians struggle. Not because there's nothing to find, but because everything is cloaked in so many layers of meaning, no one can say what's real for certain. Inside the order, the hierarchy was strict. Each rank had access to different layers of information. New recruits only knew the basics: carry out a task, no questions asked. Higher ranks might learn the target's name, location, and method, but only a handful, those closest to Hassan-i-Sabah, saw the full picture. These were the ones who could authorize the death of a vizier or cancel an order to kill a king. This tight layering created an unbreakable wall of secrecy. If a fidai was captured, torture was useless, because they truly didn't know more than their small part. They were a link in the chain, never the center. Even the mighty Seljuk Empire, which sent spies into Alamut, failed. Some vanished. Others returned with blank stares, unable to explain what they had seen or what they hadn't. No radios, no letters. And yet every assassin knew exactly when to act, where to go, and what to do, as if guided by a sixth sense. Some historians today believe the assassins operated like a living organism, with each member acting independently, yet responding to a shared mind. No one has ever proven it. But the fact that the network survived for nearly 2 centuries without being wiped out is proof enough that something was working. And one more strange thing: no one defected. No one betrayed them. No fidai was ever captured and gave away the order's secrets. Was it fear? Or did they believe, even in prison, that the order was still watching them? Maybe, but perhaps it was something deeper. Perhaps they truly believed in what they served, that death meant more than a life without ideals, and that is what made the assassins nearly invincible. They didn't just vanish from the eyes of their enemies, they vanished into the very minds of those who served them. Their enemies had no clear target, no center to strike, while the assassins could strike anywhere with nothing more than a silent glance and a dagger hidden in a sleeve. Of all the mysteries surrounding the assassin order, perhaps none shocked the outside world more than this. The way the Fidai embraced death as part of their mission, even saw it as an honor. They never asked for reward. They didn't demand safe passage. They showed no concern for their own survival once the deed was done. A single strike, one final glance. Then they calmly accepted execution, as if death were the sacred final chapter of their life's manuscript. Why would a person act this way? The answer doesn't lie in weapons or discipline. It lies deep within their faith and philosophical belief. The Fidai weren't trained to kill, they were trained to understand why they must kill. And once that reason rose above the self, death no longer held fear. The Ismaili faith, followed by the assassins, was unlike the mainstream Islam of the time. They believed in a hidden truth, passed down through a line of imams, spiritual heirs to a sacred knowledge few were allowed to access. Hassani Sabba was the torchbearer of that vision, and in the fortress of Alamut he built not just a stronghold, but a school of thought where knowledge, belief, and sacrifice merged to create men who lived for something greater than themselves. 2. The Fidai, the world was not merely a place of trials. It was a grand stage where every act carried meaning beyond time. When they struck down a tyrant, they believed they were breaking a link in a chain of oppression that stretched across centuries. And when they died, they believed they were not vanishing into nothingness, but returning to an eternal light, where all sacrifice was remembered and revered. Some records tell of Fidai who spent entire nights in silent prayer before a mission, fasting, purifying their body and mind. They didn't tremble, they didn't rage, they didn't beg. They simply walked forward as if they had already seen their fate and accepted it. To them, death wasn't an end. It was a passage to a higher realm. Western legends, like those told by Marco Polo, claimed the Fidai were shown a false paradise before their missions, a garden of unimaginable pleasures, a taste of what awaited those who remained loyal and gave their lives. Whether this was truth or myth, it reflects a deeper reality. The belief planted in each man's heart that this world is not the final destination, and only by acting in the name of truth can one reach true liberation. That is why the assassins never needed to threaten, never needed to promise. They inspired a belief so powerful it carried men beyond their instincts for survival. And when a person no longer fears death, they become the most dangerous enemy imaginable, not because of strength, but because no one knows what they fear. For empires built on violence, wealth, and hierarchy, the very existence of an organization sustained purely by will and faith was unthinkable. How do you fight someone who needs nothing but belief? How do you crush a man who welcomes death for a cause? That was the slow-burning nightmare the assassins planted in the minds of their enemies. When rulers gathered to discuss affairs of state, they didn't just worry about enemies beyond their borders. They whispered questions no one dared answer aloud. Was there a Fidai in the court? Was someone in the royal guard simply waiting? And if so, what could they do except wait? When a lord or a religious leader was killed in his own home, right in front of his most trusted guards, and the killer turned out to be someone who had lived beside him for years, the first question was never who did it. It was, how long had he been here? For the assassins, presence mattered less than timing. A Fidai could move like a shadow, breathe like the night, only to appear once, and in that single moment, changed the course of history. Fidai weren't just killers. They were actors in a long, patient play of conspiracy, one that often lasted years. They learned the enemy's language. They lived as locals, disguised as merchants, scholars, servants, even soldiers in the enemy's army. They thought like the enemy. They became the enemy and waited. Some spent their entire youth just to get one step closer to their target. One chilling account from that era tells of a Fidai who spent 13 years inside the Seljuk court. He rose to become a trusted advisor, even commanded a fortress in the king's name. Then one day, while sharing tea with his target in a quiet study, he calmly reached into his sleeve and with a single stroke plunged a dagger into the man's heart. Then he sat back down, waited to be arrested, and smiled at the guards. It wasn't an impulse. It was the culmination of over a decade of waiting, infiltration, and performance. A role played so completely, he may have forgotten where the character ended and he began. He wasn't just an assassin, he was part of the very system he had come to destroy. And that made him unstoppable from within. There is no fortress high enough to defend against that kind of weapon. No army prepared for a betrayal that's been brewing for years. The assassins didn't need to win battles. They won in the minds of their enemies. When anyone could be a killer, no one could be trusted. Kings doubted their ministers. Generals doubted their men. Fathers doubted their sons. And in that collapse of trust, the assassins didn't need to strike again. The world tore itself apart in fear. These infiltrations weren't always about killing. Some Fidai are believed to have entered other religions, studied their doctrines, participated in their rituals, even preached sermons. Not to kill, but to observe, to pass messages, or to plant ideological seeds that would later confuse, divide, or distract. One scholar wrote of debating a devout Muslim cleric, only to learn years later that man had been a Fidai in disguise. So how does someone live two lives in two opposing worlds without losing their mind? The answer lies in something we've seen before: absolute belief. When you believe every act is part of a grand design, you can live as anyone, be anything, as long as the mission is fulfilled. The assassins didn't need many men. They only needed one, a dagger in the right place, at the right time, in the hands of someone no one would ever suspect. And that was enough to shake an empire. That is why royal courts lived in constant unease. They couldn't tell who among them was real, who would strike, who would smile. As blood spilled on marble floors, no one could defeat a force that used patience as its weapon and faith as its armor. No one could ever be sure. Was the guard at the palace gate today a killer who had waited 9 years? Was the servant, pouring wine, trained to slit throats since he was 16? These were the questions with no answers. And that was the assassin's quietest, most perfect victory. A victory without armies, without battles, without war. To the Western eye, the Crusades were seen as a sacred war, a divine mission to reclaim the Holy Land from the Muslims. But in the reality of the early 12th century Middle East, it was a time of bloodshed, betrayal, and chaos. The Islamic kingdoms were fractured. The Christian Crusader states shifted constantly, conquering, betraying, and reconquering. And amid this storm of violence, there existed a small force. No flag, no army, no ambition for territory, yet feared by both sides, the assassins. At first, the West didn't understand them. To the Crusaders, the enemy was Islam. But then suddenly some of their own leaders were assassinated, without cause, without battle. Not on the battlefield, but in the street, at weddings, or while quietly eating dinner. The killers weren't ordinary Muslim soldiers. They were strangers, dressed like locals, speaking the language, and always carrying a single dagger. The assassination of Conrad of Montferrat is one of the clearest examples. He was one of the most powerful figures of the Crusades. Elected King of Jerusalem just days before he was murdered, 2 men approached him in the street and stabbed him to death in the middle of the marketplace. They were captured almost instantly, but showed no fear, no remorse. Before their execution, one of them smiled and whispered a phrase in an unknown tongue. No one understood it, but no one forgot it. Once again, the name Alamut was spoken in confusion and fear. What terrified the Christian kingdoms wasn't just the boldness of the assassination, but the unclear motive. Why would a Muslim order kill a potential ally? The answer lies at the core of the assassin philosophy. They didn't care who was Christian or Muslim. They only cared who threatened their ideal. The Crusades were fertile ground for the assassins to operate. While both sides slaughtered and plundered, the assassins maintained a fragile balance, sometimes through murder, sometimes through secret negotiations. Records suggest that some Crusader leaders even sent envoys to Alamut, seeking protection, a thinly veiled tribute in exchange for peace. This ambiguity made the assassins impossible to ignore and impossible to eliminate. They didn't need an army to have influence. With just a few deaths at the right time and place, they could alter the politics of the entire Levant. Some Christian lords tried to use them as tools, but soon discovered that no one controls. The men of Alamut. They didn't serve gold, they didn't fear threats. They moved to the rhythm of a logic no outsider could comprehend. A legend tells that King Richard I, the Lionheart, once sent a message to Hassan-i-Sabah asking him to stop targeting his troops. Hassan didn't respond with a letter. He responded with a gesture, a dagger placed beside the envoy's bed. Attached was a note. If I wished it, this would be in your heart. No one knows if the story is true, but the rumor alone was enough to keep English soldiers awake at night, trembling in the desert silence. What made the assassins truly terrifying was this. They didn't need to kill many to terrify thousands. A few deaths were enough because no one knew who would be next. No one knew where the killer was, and no one knew if someone in their own army served Alamut. In a holy war, where every side believed they carried the light, the assassins emerged as the shadow that belonged to no one. They didn't burn churches, they didn't destroy mosques, they didn't seek land or preach salvation. They simply killed the right person at the right moment and disappeared. That's why they weren't destroyed during the Crusades. No faction was united enough to fight them. No ruler dared face them head-on. And long after the Crusades faded into history, the assassins endured, a silent, invisible third force, not large, but impossible to erase. History, as always, remembers those who wield swords, but forgets those who fetched water, delivered messages, or simply stayed silent at the right moment. In the scattered records of the assassin order, the names of women are almost non-existent. No female assassins are mentioned by name. No prominent women appear in tales of daring missions, but that does not mean they weren't there. On the contrary, they were the invisible force that gave the organization its strength. Inside the fortress of Alamut, a place no outsider ever entered, women played quiet but crucial roles. They didn't carry out the killings, but they nurtured, cared for, educated, and even trained the Fida'i. Later documents uncovered in secret archives revealed that many women in the Ismaili community held deep knowledge of medicine, herbs, and antidotes, skills essential for preparing the assassins for their missions. In an organization built on secrecy, the one least suspected often holds the most power. One legend tells of a Fida'i who reached her target by posing as a newlywed wife, living with the man for months, until one day she struck. No one suspected a woman. No one thought those gentle eyes could hide a death sentence. And that was her greatest weapon: weakness perfectly performed. Ancient writings even speak of keepers of the library at Alamut, believed to be women with high education, tasked with preserving secret knowledge, maps, codes, and religious texts layered with hidden meaning. They were the keepers of the fire, ensuring that the ideals of the order would survive, no matter how many times enemies tried to burn them down. There's even a legend of a woman who served as a trusted advisor to Hassani Saba. So trusted, in fact, that he left her to make decisions during his final years of spiritual retreat. While no historical proof survives, her presence appears in multiple oral traditions, under different names but always the same image: a woman who did not carry a dagger but chose who would. History often depicts medieval women as confined to kitchens, harems, or chapels. But in the assassin order, they could be messengers, trainers, codebreakers, and perhaps even the one who ended a king's life without ever lifting a weapon. They didn't seek attention. They existed as part of the hidden framework, the spine in the shadows. Remarkably, women in the assassin order were not treated as property, as in many other societies of the time. They were given access to knowledge, trained in critical thought, and entrusted with secrets. This breaking of gender roles allowed the order to remain flexible and hidden for nearly 2 centuries, because when no one suspects a woman, she becomes the unseen link that holds everything together. To this day, descendants of the Ismaili tradition still speak of the women's role as essential to the community. They don't celebrate individual names, but they insist on one truth: in the dark, nothing survives without the hand that keeps the flame alive. And perhaps in those quiet years when Fida'i was sent into the world to kill in silence, there were also women, nameless, faceless, who sent them, who prepared every step, and who waited knowing they would not return. Their sacrifice was never written down, but it is etched deep into the soul of the order, a soul that even now history has yet to fully acknowledge. Alamut was never the largest fortress in history. It had no deep moats, no towering cannon-studded walls, no garrisons of thousands like the castles of medieval Europe, and yet, strangely, every army that ever laid siege to it failed, not because of overwhelming force, but because they never truly understood what Alamut was. Perched precariously among the Alborz mountains of Persia, Alamut was like a crack between heaven and earth. There was only one narrow trail that led to its main gate, and only those permitted ever found the true path. The terrain was so treacherous that even an army of thousands could be stopped by a few hidden archers high above. But its defense wasn't what made Alamut terrifying. Inside the fortress, according to the rare accounts of Muslim historians who passed through the region, was an entirely different world, a realm of philosophy, discipline, and spiritual rigor. thick stone walls, deep corridors, secret chambers linked by narrow passageways, all seemingly designed not just to protect information, but to reshape the mind. This was not a place to hide, but a place to transform people into instruments of a timeless ideal. There were no prisons, no torture chambers, but there was intellectual control, harsh and exacting. No one in Alamut knew the full truth. Each person knew only their task, interacted selectively, learned only what was necessary, and believed that should death come, it would carry meaning beyond the reach of mortal understanding. The library of Alamut, ancient sources say, held not only multiple copies of the Quran, but also texts on mathematics, astronomy, medicine, Greek philosophy, and writings of Indian scholars. This wasn't just a base for assassination, it was a quiet center of knowledge where learning was preserved and repurposed in service of a goal few would ever fully comprehend. Scholars inside Alamut didn't debate theology, they dissected it. They analyzed faith not as sacred dogma but as a tool of ideology. The Fidari were not taught blind belief, but were trained to understand why faith could lead to radical action, and more importantly, why death could be embraced if it served a confirmed truth. What kept Alamut standing for nearly 2 centuries was not its stone walls, but the fear it inspired in those beyond them. No one knew what was happening inside. No one knew who lived there, who trained there, or who was planning the next assassination. There were no flags, no signals, no declarations of war, only silence, the kind of silence that stretches over mountains waiting to swallow anyone who dares to break it. Though besieged many times, Alamut never fell to outside force. Those who came close often withdrew in doubt. Some who tried to climb its slopes were shot down without a trace, and those who entered uninvited often disappeared entirely, their bodies never found. It wasn't death that terrified people most. It was being erased, to be forgotten, to vanish from history itself. And Alamut understood this better than anyone. When an empire reaches the height of its power, it begins to believe that everything lies within its grasp. Armies, wealth, law, even destiny itself. But those who faced the assassin order learned a far more terrifying truth. The worst kind of defeat isn't losing. It's not knowing what you're fighting. Medieval empires were trained to fight with cavalry, arrows, stone walls, and blood. But when your enemy is an idea, dressed in coarse robes, hiding a dagger in his sleeve, no strategy can prepare you. The first and most direct enemy of the assassins was the Seljuk Empire, a powerful Islamic dynasty that spanned most of Persia and Central Asia in the 11th century. The Seljuks had a strong bureaucracy, elite armies, and a court whose influence stretched from Baghdad to the Syrian coast. To them, the assassins were heretics, a dangerous seed of rebellion that had to be uprooted. The mighty vizier Nizam al-Mulk once declared, "A tree cannot survive with worms in its roots," and he viewed the Ismailis as that worm. But fate had its irony. Nizam became the first victim, stabbed by a Fidai during pilgrimage, surrounded by guards, felled by a single dagger. His death shattered Seljuk politics and sent a message: when the worm learns to wield a blade, the whole tree trembles. Next came Sultan Malik Shah, who once vowed to wipe Alamut from the map. He died suddenly just months after Nizam. No proof ever linked the assassins, but from that day forward, fear replaced action. The desire to destroy the order faded, replaced by whispers and hesitation. Even the leaders of the Crusades weren't spared. As mentioned before, Conrad of Montferrat, elected king of Jerusalem, was stabbed in broad daylight by two strangers. No one knew why. A Muslim group killing a Christian leader made everyone question. Were the assassins enemies or allies? And that confusion was their deadliest strike, when no one knows whether to kill or negotiate with the man who might already be holding a blade to your throat. But the most relentless enemy, and the one that ultimately brought the assassins to ruin, was the Mongol Empire. The Mongols didn't care for religion. They feared no god. They did not negotiate. As they swept west, burning Baghdad, destroying libraries and slaughtering millions, they set their sights on Alamut. They knew to control Persia, they had to destroy the invisible web of assassins first. Hulagu Khan, grandson of Genghis Khan, personally led the invasion into the Alborz Mountains. Unlike other empires that relied on sieges or diplomacy, Hulagu brought with him the unmatched siegecraft of the Mongols. He surrounded Alamut for months, and for the first time in nearly 200 years, the assassins faced something they were unprepared for, an enemy who feared nothing, not death, not negotiation, not even their silence. In the end, Alamut fell, not in glory, not in resistance, but in silence. Those who remained burned the library, destroyed the archives, and erased all traces. When the Mongols entered the fortress, they found an empty shell, like a riddle with no answer. No leaders captured, no treasure found, no ideology uncovered, just scorched walls and defaced symbols, as if history itself was trying to hide what had lived there. And yet, though Alamut crumbled and the assassins disbanded, their legacy was not destroyed. No army, no matter how brutal, can kill an idea, and the assassins, though no longer a state, no longer a fortress, lived on in whispers, in strange assassinations, in secrets buried beneath the ashes of empires. Their enemies believed they had won. But if you listen closely on a quiet night, somewhere in the Persian hills, you might still hear it, the sound of a dagger unsheathing, soft as breath. No organization is perfect. Even the most skilled assassins, even plans forged over months, even years, sometimes fail. But for the assassins, failure was never the end. On the contrary, it was fuel, a whetstone for their most dangerous, invisible weapon, patience. History rarely records failed assassinations, partly because of shame, partly because no one survived to tell the tale. But scattered across Islamic chronicles, Crusader journals, and folk legend, there remain whispers of knives turned aside at the last second, of agents captured before the strike, of plots uncovered at the final hour. One of the most famous failures was the attempted assassination of Saladin, the legendary Muslim leader who unified Egypt and Syria to stand against the Crusaders. For years, Saladin had waged campaigns against the assassins, besieging their fortresses and calling for their annihilation. But one night, deep in his own encampment, a fidai, disguised as a servant, crept close to his bedside. He would have struck, but a guard, who switched shifts earlier than expected, caught him. He was subdued and executed on the spot. Saladin survived. But from that night on, he never slept without a guard beside his bed. He also never again ordered the assassin's destruction. Instead, there was silence. Perhaps a letter, perhaps a gift, or simply an unspoken understanding between two powers that knew neither could destroy the other. In that sense, the fidai had succeeded after all, not in taking a life, but in planting a warning directly in the heart of one of the most powerful men alive. Another case recorded in Damascus involved a prominent judge who regularly condemned the Ismailis in public sermons, calling for their total eradication. A Fidai infiltrated his lectures, posing as a quiet student for months. On the chosen day, as he prepared to act, he stopped. Not out of fear, but because he realized the judge was more tightly guarded than expected. He withdrew, leaving no trace. A rare decision. But weeks later, another team arrived. This time, the mission was completed. That's the lesson. The assassins were not driven by emotion or personal vengeance. They were a machine of logic, willing to delay, retreat, and adapt. Failure was not punished. No one was executed for failing to kill. Instead, failures were studied like new terrain. Every mistake a map of the enemy's weaknesses, recorded and remembered. Sometimes it wasn't the assassins who failed. It was the victims who outplayed them. There was once a lord who changed. His routines constantly, no set meal times, no fixed sleeping chambers, no visitors at night. He only ate food prepared by blood relatives. One day, he noticed a man in a group of pilgrims, watching, trailing him for 4 days. He had the man seized. Before he could speak, the Fidai bit down on a capsule of poison sewn into his robe and died without a word. No one was killed that day, but the attempt changed the city. Gates closed earlier, troops doubled, every traveler scrutinized. No life was taken, but the fear was perfectly placed, and that was what the assassins understood better than anyone. It's not death itself, but the anticipation of death that is the real weapon. Used correctly, failure could echo louder than success. A missed strike may kill no one, but it can rob a kingdom of sleep for years to come. History marks the fall of Alamut in the year 1256 at the hands of the Mongol army led by Hulagu Khan. It was a devastating blow, a ruthless incision into the very heart of the assassin order. But the strange part is this. After the strike, there were no ashes, no bodies, no captured leaders, no grand libraries seized, no treasure discovered. It was as if the people who had lived within that fortress had vanished from history itself just days before the invaders arrived. What remained were broken walls, shattered symbols, and strange markings scratched from stone, as if someone had deliberately erased every trace, protecting something far more sacred than life itself. Did the assassins choose to destroy themselves before their enemies could? No one knows. But after 1256, the name assassin disappeared from public life. No more killings, no more warnings, no more messages hidden in the shadows. The other fortresses in their network were gradually abandoned or repurposed. Those who survived scattered among the population. No one could say if they were still alive, or if they had chosen to disappear forever. Some theorize that a handful of them survived, reforming into secret societies that passed on Ismaili teachings in quieter, more adaptable form, no longer tied to armies or religious structures. Some may have hidden in remote mountain communities, living as ordinary people, yet still guarding secret rituals, not to kill, but to keep a flame alive. Others whisper that a few Fidai were sent on missions and never called back, not because they failed, but because no one summoned them home. And so they lived on, watching, blending into distant lands, still carrying a philosophy no outsider could ever understand. Perhaps they joined other faiths, even slipped into modern governments, not to assassinate, but to guard the final secret of the assassins, why they ever existed at all. From the 14th century onward, the organization was no longer known as assassins. But in the northern hills of Iran, a quiet branch of the Ismaili community still survives to this day. They live peacefully, unarmed, without vengeance, but carry with them a centuries-old tradition, a structured body of knowledge, oral texts passed from memory to memory, and one unbreakable rule: never let outsiders fully understand. And maybe that is the key to their survival. They didn't die, they transformed. When the world changed, they changed. When their name was erased, they took new names. When darkness was hunted, they learned to live in the light, in ways no one could truly see. No more daggers, no more gates, but the principles remain, resting quietly in the underground currents of history. Maybe the assassins are truly gone, or maybe they are simply silent. And if they do still exist, the true lesson they left behind is not found in the blood they spilled, but in something far more chilling. How a small, stateless group with no army, armed only with knowledge of fear and faith, could bend the course of history for over 2 centuries. And if you think it's over, ask yourself this: why is it that even today the word assassin still makes us shiver, even when no one is left to kill? History often forgets the defeated, the small armies, the fringe ideas, the ones not endorsed by kings or written into official records. And yet sometimes it is those cast to the edges of the page that survived the longest. The Assassin Order is one such legacy, a story not found in schoolbooks but alive in memory, in symbols, in imagination, and in the whispered folklore of humankind. After vanishing from political history, the name assassin did not die. On the contrary, it spread, became stranger, more flexible, more eternal than ever before. From the 14th century onward, writers, historians, and wandering storytellers began to speak of the assassins not as an organization, but as a symbol of mystery, of absolute loyalty, of an unseen order no one fully understood. In Europe, the word assassin gradually became a general term for anyone who killed with purpose, regardless of religion or origin. And even though the term was simplified, the shadow behind it never changed: a person who kills not for money, but for belief. And that is why the word carries weight across time. In medieval literature, especially in Old French, Italian, and Latin manuscripts, the assassins were portrayed as keepers of ancient knowledge, living in high mountain fortresses, moving like lightning, disappearing like mist. They weren't called mere killers. They were described as the minds in shadow, guardians of secrets the world was never meant to know. Western travelers like Marco Polo added to the haze. In his writings, he spoke of a false paradise, where assassins were shown pleasures beyond imagining, promised they would return if they died for their cause. Historians now question the truth of this tale. But in the realm of myth, uncertainty only makes the story stronger. Legends of the assassins continued into poetry, theatre, and religion, each adding its own layer. In some Muslim communities, they were seen as heretics, yet spoken of in hushed voices as men who lived for something greater than themselves. In Europe, they were tied to secret societies, the Templars, the Freemasons, even the Illuminati, as if every mysterious group to come was somehow their descendant. In the modern world, the assassin has become a global icon. They appear in films, novels, and most famously, in video games, with Assassin's Creed being the clearest example. There, they are reimagined as warriors of freedom, fighting against a hidden world order. Though mixed with fiction, the essence remains. The belief that a single person, if they act with conviction and timing, can change the course of history. And perhaps what draws us to them is not the violence, but the resolve. Not the blades, but the idea that even in a world ruled by systems and surveillance, someone might still choose to live in shadow to protect the last sliver of light. The legacy of the assassins is not a list of deaths, it is a feeling that something is always happening behind our backs in silence with patience never seen, but never gone, and that is why we remember them. Not as an organization, but as a symbol of what humans can do when they believe in something greater than themselves. No secret organization survives for long without its own system of rituals, not just for communication, but to nurture a sacred divide between those within and those forever outside. For the assassins, these rituals were not merely religious ceremony. They were a coded language, a way to conceal information and to discipline the soul. And the most chilling truth? Nearly everything we know about them is speculation. The fidai, those who pledged to die for this cause, did not join with a simple oath. They passed through a closed, grueling, almost mystical process. Fragmented accounts describe new initiates kept in isolation for weeks, cut off from the world, exposed only to cryptic sermons, perhaps drawn from scripture, perhaps from philosophy, or maybe something that fused the two. Nothing was written down. Knowledge was transmitted through ritual and symbol, as if the only way to understand truth was to live it. Symbols were the essence. In the assassin order, every carving, every folded slip of paper, every object misplaced on purpose carried meaning. One story tells of a fidai being summoned not with a message, not with a word, but with a single olive branch, tied with black thread left on his doorstep. He saw it, understood, and vanished into the night. That was the command. Language spoken in silence. Even the very architecture of Alamut was said to be symbolic. Some corridors led nowhere. Certain staircases turned the wrong way in the dark. Rooms were designed so a whisper could carry to a place far away. To navigate it, one had to be awakened, to read the space with eyes no outsider would ever develop. Unusual traditions were also noted. Before an assassination, a fidai did not simply depart. He performed a private rite, reciting an ancient verse, kissing a carved stone, or lighting a candle and extinguishing it in silence. Each had his own way, but all pointed toward one belief. They never acted alone. They were part of something larger, something eternal. Even their speech was encoded. A greeting might not mean hello. A question might be an order to kill. A parable might contain a location, a date, a name. Which is why outsiders never learned how they truly communicated, because their words were just the surface of a shared collective experience. Modern scholars suggest the assassins developed a kind of sacred language, never written, never taught, but etched into the mind through repetition and rite. Once absorbed, a member could go anywhere, hear any phrase, and know what must be done without being told. And remarkably, those symbols did not die when the order fell. They began to appear faintly in Middle Eastern architecture, in handwritten manuscripts of European secret societies, even in faded frescoes of ancient monasteries in Italy and Spain. Were these the remnants of the order, or merely the quiet migration of ideas, passed from soul to soul, from era to era, without ever needing a name? What we know for certain is this: No outsider ever fully understood the assassin's system of symbols. No historian has decoded a complete ritual. And that is why the assassins were never fully unmasked, because they never wrote down what mattered most. They lived it. They died with it. They passed it on, with a glance, a breath, a gesture. When you understand that ritual was not meant to hide truth from others, but to remind the faithful of who they truly were, you begin to see why the order did not crumble with the fortress walls, for within those symbols they preserved their essence, and that essence may still be alive, even if no one remains to speak its name. When we look at the daggers, the shocking assassinations, and the sudden deaths met with calm, unwavering eyes, it's easy to call them killers, but stopping there means missing the most important truth. The assassins did not act like mercenaries. They moved with purpose, with spiritual intent, rational conviction, and a mystery that remains unsolved. The philosophy they followed was inseparable from the ideas of the Ismaili faith, a branch of Shia Islam that believes truth does not lie only in words, but in the hidden meanings layered beneath language and symbol. To them, the Quran was not just law. It was a cipher, a map pointing toward a higher reality, one that only those who had awakened could read, and those who awakened believed. It was their duty to maintain balance in the world at any cost. For the assassins, killing was not an act of rebellion. It was a corrective gesture, a necessary cut to realign the world when it drifted off course. To them, a tyrant king, a hate-spewing cleric, a corrupt judge were not simply enemies, but misaligned links in the wheel of history. And their mission was to sever those links, so the wheel would not crush everyone beneath it. Outsiders saw only death, but insiders saw restored order. Not everyone was a target. Only those believed to bring destruction upon the world if allowed to remain. Many Fidai acted without direct orders. They sensed the imbalance, they understood the logic, and they moved about as if they were cells within a greater mind that did not need to speak. Ancient texts mention assassins meditating, reciting scripture, or reflecting on philosophy before a mission. They did not kill in anger. They acted with clarity, as if performing a sacred rite, not a crime, and that's what terrified the rulers most. The man who kills the king isn't a criminal. He's someone who believes he's saving the world. This belief was not born in blood, but in books. Alamut wasn't just a training ground, it was a school of thought, where people studied Greek philosophy, Indian mathematics, Babylonian, astronomy, and even banned religious texts. Within those stone walls they debated free will, the nature of power, and the limits of morality. And from that emerged a terrifying conclusion. In a rotting world, to kill one person might be the most moral act. Not everyone can understand that. Fewer still can accept it. But that is why the Fidai could die without hesitation. They did not seek reward. They did not expect paradise. They simply believed that doing what is right, even if misunderstood, even if cursed, even if erased from memory, must still be done. And that is why the assassins were unlike any other group in history. Today, some see them as criminals. Some call them warriors. Others, extreme philosophers. But no matter what we name them, they leave behind one question that no one has yet answered. If a person sees evil coming clearly, undeniably, and they have one chance to stop it, should they act? The assassins never asked for an answer. They simply acted and left behind a pause in history that never fully fades. Amid all the stories of daggers tucked in sleeves, killings no one saw coming, and mountain-top fortresses shrouded in mist, there is one truth rarely mentioned, but perhaps more important than all the rest. The assassins were, above all, readers. It was no coincidence that the most sacred place in Alamut was not the armory nor the prison, but the library. There, in the soft glow of oil lamps and the cold hush of stone corridors, hundreds of sacred texts, maps, ancient scrolls, and philosophical manuscripts were copied, preserved, and memorized. According to scattered records, the founder of the order, Hassani Sabah, spent hours each day not training assassins to kill, but teaching them to understand the world. To him, the blade was merely the result. The true cause lay in how one perceived justice, power, and truth. Assassins, trained at Alamut, did not just learn to move silently or strike in crowds. They studied Greek philosophy, Indian mathematics, astronomy, medicine, and texts forbidden by the ruling religious authorities of their time. They read Aristotle. They learned to dissect language, and most importantly, they were trained to challenge their teachers, to question everything. From this environment emerged a generation of fidai not as mindless weapons but as rational actors, philosophers of action. Each assassination was not a blind command. It was the end point of debate, analysis, and moral deliberation. They believed, only by understanding the value of a human life do you earn the right to take one. The Alamut Library was said to be a one-of-a-kind knowledge sanctuary in the medieval world. Not only did it house Islamic texts, but also Jewish, Christian, Persian, and even Egyptian writings. In an age when most burned what they feared, the assassins collected, translated, and protected knowledge, not to boast, but because they believed it was the most silent, most enduring form of power. This made them enemies on all sides. They were hated by religious authorities for guarding heretical knowledge and feared by kings for using thought to manipulate politics. An assassin could be killed, but an idea, a reinterpreted verse, an unanswered question could outlive empires. Some fidai were sent not to kill, but to debate. They traveled to distant lands, posing as scholars, and quietly undermined rigid belief systems with gentle, unanswerable questions. They didn't preach. They didn't incite. They simply planted seeds of doubt. And in many cases, that was enough to collapse a structure long before blood was spilled. Today, most of Alamut's library is lost, burned, or vanished into history. But fragments have surfaced in European monasteries, in ancient archives across Syria, Egypt, and Persia. They bear no assassin seal, but in their method of interpretation, their depth of language, their precision of logic, a familiar presence lingers like an invisible signature. Yes, the assassins killed. But more than that, they stayed up through the night, reading, debating, to understand why the act of killing should ever matter. And if there is one thing that truly sets them apart from every other force of death in history, it is this. They believed that intellect was not just a tool for living well, but the only way to die with honor. Perhaps the assassin order vanished from official history in the 13th century. But strangely, the further they drift from time, the sharper their silhouette becomes in the public imagination. No longer present on any map, absent from war reports, they now live in books, in films, and most vividly, in our collective imagination. A symbol no one fully understands, yet everyone feels is somehow still present. It was in the West that the image of the assassins first became romanticized. By the 14th and 15th centuries, French, Italian, and Latin manuscripts began to describe them not merely as killers, but as knights of the shadows, enlightened ones who acted outside the law in service of a higher truth. They were no longer heretics. They were intellectual warriors fighting not for glory, but to protect what had been buried, the truth. In the 18th and 19th centuries, as Europe entered the Age of Enlightenment and then the Industrial Revolution, the name assassin re-emerged, not in history books, but in literature and politics. In a world beginning to question religion, challenge the state, and confront authority, the assassins became a metaphor for those willing to stand alone in the dark against oppressive systems. Poets, romantic philosophers, even revolutionaries borrowed the image of the assassin to speak for the rebels with ideals, those who did not fight for personal gain but for a fairer order, even if the cost was their life. And in that reimagining, the hunted became a voice for those who had none. In the 20th century, film and television breathed new life into the symbol. Masked figures fighting in the shadows, guided by personal codes, unanswerable to any authority. These characters all echoed the assassin. They weren't always named, but in stories like V for Vendetta, The Matrix, or any tale of spies and rogue hackers, the spirit of the assassin became a silent blueprint for modern resistance. Then came the video game, Assassin's Creed. And with it, the image was catapulted into global consciousness. Though rich in fiction, the game kept the essence intact. The assassin stands between two worlds, neither hero nor villain, but someone who acts to protect human freedom from absolute control. Players weren't just controlling a killer. They stepped into the role of a person facing down a hidden order that watches all, governs all. The message resonated, and because it reflected something deep and modern, the sense that we are watched, managed, and silently longing for escape, for a way back to our truest self. And perhaps that is why the image of the assassin never fades. In every era where power becomes too absolute, when law no longer protects justice, when the weak are silenced, people remember the faceless silhouettes in the dark, the blades in the night, and those who dared to die not for themselves, but to restore balance to history. Today, the assassin is no longer an event. They are a feeling. The feeling that no matter how tight the world's grip becomes, someone is still watching, still waiting, not to kill, but to awaken. As the world entered the modern age, historians began digging into the hazy corners of Middle Eastern history. And almost immediately, they hit a strange wall, a lack of direct evidence. What we know about the assassins comes mostly from their enemies, Islamic historians, Crusader chronicles, and Western travelers like Marco Polo. But in all these sources, truth and legend swirl together like sand and mist. No internal documents have survived. The library of Alamut was either burned or hidden before the Mongols arrived. The Fidai left no memoirs. Symbols etched into stone were chiseled away. Hallways led to nowhere. They left no history, only absence. And in that absence, generations have been drawn in. As if the less we know, the more we need to know. Archaeologists began to comb the Alborz Mountains, trying to locate the true sites of assassin strongholds. Some traces were found. Foundations, pottery shards, fragments of stone walls worn with time. But nothing conclusive, no weapons, no maps, no names, and most notably, no trace of philosophy. Scattered manuscripts surfaced in old libraries in Syria, Iran, Egypt, and even Europe, but none speak directly of the organization's structure, They contain only abstract philosophy, symbolic poetry, and concepts that blur religion and metaphysics. And so scholars find themselves in a strange position. They can read the words, but not the meaning. Some Western historians in the 19th and 20th centuries even questioned if the assassins truly existed. Perhaps they were exaggerated, perhaps just a small group inflated by medieval myth-making, but that theory too was challenged by the silence, because if the assassins were merely legend, why did so many empires write letters pleading for a peace? Why did Crusader kings increase their personal guard? Why did the Mongols send an entire army to destroy them? A ghost doesn't provoke such real reactions. In the 21st century, new efforts have emerged, from historians to cryptographers, trying to decode the fragments that remain. They've found correlations between Alamut's architecture and ancient mathematical patterns, between Ismaili poetry and symbolic logic systems. But each discovery leads to a bigger question. Were these patterns accidental, or were they part of a deliberate system, designed so that only insiders could understand? Some theories suggest that the spirit of the assassins lives on in other secret traditions, in Sufi orders, in the Knights Templar, even in 18th century European secret societies. No direct proof exists, but the overlaps in structure, symbols, and rituals have led many to ask, did the assassins vanish? Or did they fragment and flow into other hidden currents, living on without their name? And perhaps the final question is not, what is the truth? But rather, do we even want to find it? Or are we simply enchanted by a mystery that remains unsolved? The assassins were a group of action, but their greatest legacy may lie in inaction, or in the moment they disappeared. Because sometimes the most haunting thing is not the figure waiting in a dark alley, but the quiet certainty that someone once stood there and left no trace behind. Our world today is a far cry from the age in which the assassins once walked. There are no more stone fortresses perched on cliffs, no couriers riding through the night to deliver encrypted orders. We live in a world of satellite surveillance, real-time data, smartphones, artificial intelligence, and algorithms that know what we think before we do. And in a world like this, you'd think, there's no more room for those who choose to hide, but strangely, it is in this era of total surveillance that the shadow of the assassins becomes more visible than ever. Modern life holds a paradox. The more we connect, the more we are watched. Every step, every search, every message leaves a trace. We don't live in a fortress. We live in a global glass house where every behavior can be measured, profiled, redirected, and in this invisible atmosphere, a quiet thought begins to surface. I am being controlled. It is here that the assassins, though distant in time, re-emerge as a symbol of instinctive resistance. They do not stand for violence. They stand for the right to remain anonymous, the right to think privately, and the ability to act outside the system. Things the modern human may not even realize they are yearning for. A teenager with headphones, eyes fixed on a glowing screen, is sometimes not just playing a game. He is living a piece of instinct the real world no longer allows, to be outside the system. In games, in film, in fiction, in art, the assassin appears as an invisible companion, whispering, "It is still possible to hold on to a piece of personal freedom in a world that feels pre-programmed." And that feeling doesn't just live in imagination. It shows up whenever someone limits what they share, chooses privacy mode, encrypts a message, leaves social media, or covers the webcam lens. These are no longer random acts. They are the modern signals of a silent rebellion, And if you look closer, you'll see this is the resurrection of the assassin's spirit. No orders, no fortress, just the awareness that something must be kept for yourself. The modern world may no longer allow an organization like the assassins to exist in their traditional form. But that same world awakens the same reflexes they once lived by. When someone uses a VPN to mask their location, when a journalist encrypts their conversations to avoid surveillance, when an anonymous coder uncovers a scandal and releases it to the world, they don't call themselves Widerhimt, but they are living the same spirit, acting in the shadows for a truth greater than themselves, and in that the assassins are no longer history. They are a condition of the modern mind. A part of us always wants to know the truth. Another part is afraid that knowing it might cost us everything, and between those two forces we make quiet decisions to live a little less exposed, just like they once did. There may no longer be daggers in the dark, but each time we question our personal freedom, our right to privacy, our trust in the system, each time we do that, the shadow of a group who once lived through silence and willpower lives again inside us. At this point in history, the assassins have long been described as something that once existed and then disappeared. But if you look closely at how they operated, you'll notice something important. The assassins were never built as a traditional organization. They were a fragmented structure, self-adjusting, self-sustaining, and most importantly, based not on property, but on philosophy. And that is why a theory whispered by many modern scholars, yet rarely spoken aloud, begins to emerge that assassins never vanished. They simply changed form. Like open source code that belongs to no one, the assassin mindset can live on in any person or any group as long as they follow one principle: act with purpose, in silence. Not for the self, but for a truth beyond the self. Look at today's world. There are human rights activists who appear from nowhere, drop shocking truths, then vanish into the fog of data. There are whistleblowers inside massive institutions who go off-grid just to bring evidence into the light. They carry no daggers. They don't live on mountaintops, but their motives, their methods, and their disappearances feel eerily familiar. There are even non-organizations today, no leaders, no headquarters, no hierarchy, and yet they unsettle governments, giant corporations, and global power brokers. They operate through encryption, distributed knowledge, and a strict rule. No one holds the full truth alone. Each person is just a fragment, exactly like the structure the assassins used to survive for over 200 years. And that leads to a larger hypothesis. The assassins don't need to exist in their old form. They can be reborn through behavior, through structure, through thought. In an age where everything is monitored, the best way to hide is in plain sight. They might be in encrypted forums behind anonymous usernames. They might be the scientist writing privacy algorithms, the designer building tools to escape censorship, the teacher in a quiet village sharing ideas that fracture the walls of deception. The key is, they don't need to call themselves assassins. They never did. All it takes is one person who understands and acts at the right moment, and the spirit lives again. Without a name, without recognition, and if that theory is true, then perhaps you've already encountered them. A single post you read, a message that made you question something, a quiet gesture you once witnessed, could carry the DNA of a way of thinking nurtured across centuries, surviving every hunt, outlasting every empire, not to kill, but to protect the last remaining truth in a world drowning in noise. There are symbols that exist because of power. Some endure through victory, but a rare few live on simply because they ask a question no one dares to answer. The assassins were one of them. From the very beginning, they chose the path of paradox: to kill in order to protect life, to vanish in order to preserve truth, to make no declaration, but force the entire world to take notice. And within that paradox, they awakened something far deeper: doubt. Because every human being, no matter the system they live in, an empire, a faith, a nation, a corporation, carries a primal suspicion deep down. What if everything around me is running on the wrong track? And when the system becomes too vast, too tight, too perfect, we no longer know where to look or who to ask. So we go silent, and in that silence the assassins emerge, not with answers, but with the courage to ask the question for us. They never told us what to believe. They never demanded action. They simply appeared, a blurred face, a silent strike when all others stayed quiet. And when we look at them, what chills us is not the dagger in their hand, but the haunting question. What did they see that made them act like this? The assassins did not inspire admiration in the traditional sense. No grand speeches, no monuments, no heroic anthems, but they made people afraid without being hated, curious but never bold enough to approach. And above all, they made people doubt themselves in the quiet of their own minds. That is power, a kind you cannot measure. We live in a modern world where justice is defined by law. But sometimes we all feel that something's still off, still unsaid, still unresolved, and in that moment we don't need a military, we don't need a revolution, we just need a single nod in the dark, someone who understands and moves at the right time. That's what the assassins became, the embodiment of that exact moment, the one who speaks no words, but acts at the precise place, in the precise hour. Not because they are good, but because they see what's slowly going wrong. And perhaps the most compelling thing is, they never asked to be believed. They didn't preach, they didn't apologize, they didn't beg to be understood. They simply acted and disappeared. They left a cut. Not just on flesh, but across the current of history. A single incision, thin, silent, surgical, yet deep enough to make empires stop, look back, and fear again. They force us to ask ourselves, if someone is willing to kill to protect a truth we cannot see, what have we missed? And when that question echoes, we begin to re-examine everything we once thought certain. Can law be wrong? Can religion be abused? Can governments bend the truth? And if everything we know can be twisted, then what is left that is truly straight? We've walked together through the length of a story with no clear beginning and no real end, because the assassins were never meant to be a complete legend. They were an emptiness, deliberately carved out by absence. In a world where every power wants to be seen, known, praised, they chose to leave behind only a question. That question is not written on paper. It lives in the wary eyes of kings who once found daggers on their pillows, in the sudden change of a law, in the quiet death with no known cause, in the way an empire silently steps back, not because it was defeated, but because it knew it was being watched. We may never know the full truth, and maybe we're not supposed to, because sometimes what matters is not their story, but the feeling they leave behind in us, a feeling with no name, but one that makes us hesitate when we hear a voice that's too loud, or see power that's too quiet, or witness someone walking against the current. Not for fame, not for gain, but because they see something wrong. If the assassins left behind any true legacy, it wasn't the daggers or the fortress or the coded symbols. It was a human ability we all have, but few dare to use, the courage to stand alone in silence for what is right. And if that stirred something in you, if you find yourself still thinking, still searching for the missing pages of history, the truths that don't appear in textbooks, the people with no statues who still change the course of entire eras, then stay. Because this isn't the end, it's just a pause, so you can hit subscribe, and when you're ready, we'll go deeper, quieter, and just as haunting. Thank you for listening. With your ears, with your patience, and with a heart that still dares to ask questions. If there's a story you'd like us to explore next, a mystery still untold, leave a comment below. Sometimes the next journey begins with your question.